HOA Karen called wildlife officers to arrest me for fishing on my own lake, but they discovered the truth, shook my hand, and exposed her abuse of power before everyone. Welcome back, everyone. Before today's story begins, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. If this is your first time on the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll always know when a new story is released. Your support means more than you know. Every like, comment, and subscription helps this channel grow and allows us to keep sharing incredible stories with viewers around the world. And before we begin, tell me this, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Now, grab a comfortable seat, relax, and let's dive into today's unforgettable story. The strangest part wasn't that she called the wildlife officers. It was the moment they arrived, looked at me, and smiled instead of reaching for handcuffs. The morning started with the smell of cold lake water mixing with fresh pine drifting through the air. The sun had barely touched the surface of Silver Pines Lake when I heard the sound that didn't belong there. A vehicle door slammed. Then another. I looked up from my fishing rod and saw two official trucks rolling down the gravel path toward the shoreline. Their tires crushed the small stones beneath them, sending sharp cracks through the quiet morning. For a second, I thought someone had gotten hurt. Then I saw her. Victoria Harrington, HOA president, professional complainer. The woman who had spent the last 6 months trying to convince everyone that a lake she didn't own somehow belonged to her. She stepped out of her luxury SUV wearing a perfectly pressed white jacket and that same confident smile she always wore when she thought she had already won. Her perfume reached me before her voice did. "Officer, that's him." She pointed at me like I was some criminal hiding in plain sight. "That man is illegally fishing on HOA property." I slowly lowered my fishing rod. I remember looking around that morning, almost expecting to find someone else standing behind me. Someone who actually had done something wrong. But there was nobody. Just me. My old tackle box. My father's fishing rod. And the lake my family had protected for over 30 years. The wildlife officer stepped closer, his boots pressing into the damp soil near the waterline. He looked at Victoria, then at me, then back at Victoria. And that was the moment her confidence started to disappear. Because she thought she had called them to prove she was right. She had no idea she had just invited the one person who knew the truth. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and before this day, I was just a man trying to enjoy a quiet morning by the water. I wasn't looking for a fight. I wasn't trying to challenge anyone. I had spent most of my life avoiding people who needed power more than they needed fairness. But Victoria Harrington was different. She didn't just want to manage a neighborhood. She wanted to control everything inside it. Every mailbox, every driveway, every tree. And eventually, she decided she wanted control over the lake behind my house. The same lake where my father taught me how to tie my first fishing knot. The same shoreline where I scattered his ashes after he passed away. The same water that held decades of memories before Victoria ever showed up with her HOA paperwork and expensive sunglasses. She believed a few printed rules gave her ownership. She believed a title on a committee board made her untouchable. And that morning, standing there with wildlife officers watching, she was absolutely certain she was about to teach me a lesson. What she didn't know was that I had spent years learning the laws she was trying to twist. She didn't know about the documents hidden in my father's old metal box. She didn't know why those officers recognized my name. And she definitely didn't know that the man she was trying to remove from the lake was the same person who helped protect it years before. The funny thing about people who abuse power is they always think they are the smartest person in the room. Until the room gets quiet. Until the paperwork comes out. Until the truth finally arrives. And Victoria was about to discover that the law doesn't care how expensive your SUV is or how many people you intimidate. It only cares who is actually right. The first time Victoria Harrington saw my father's lake, she didn't see the memories hidden beneath the water. She saw an opportunity. And that was the mistake that started everything. My family's connection to Silver Pines Lake began long before there were paved roads, matching mailboxes, or a sign at the entrance welcoming people to the neighborhood. My father, Thomas Caldwell, bought that piece of land when the area was still quiet countryside. Back then, there were no luxury homes overlooking the water. No HOA meetings. No people carrying clipboards and pretending they owned the world. There was just the lake. And there was our little cabin sitting 50 yards from the shoreline. I still remember the sound of that old wooden dock moving with the waves. the smell of my father's coffee mixing with the morning fog, the rough texture of the fishing rod he placed in my hands when I was 10 years old. Respect the water, Ethan, he always told me, because the water remembers who takes care of it. I didn't understand those words when I was a kid. I do now. After my father passed away, I inherited the property and the responsibility that came with it. I wasn't interested in turning it into some expensive vacation spot. I didn't want to build a resort or sell pieces of land to developers. I just wanted to keep it exactly the way he left it. Quiet, simple, honest. For years, I worked as a natural resources specialist, helping protect wetlands, waterways, and wildlife habitats across the state. I spent my career studying the rules that protected places like Silver Pines Lake. Ironically, the same knowledge that helped me protect other people's land would eventually be the reason Victoria Harrington lost control of hers. But she didn't know any of that. When Silver Pines Lakeside Community was built nearby, I tried to be a good neighbor. I attended meetings. I paid attention to their concerns. I even helped answer questions about erosion and water management when construction started. That was before Victoria became HOA president. The first time I met her, she arrived at my property in a black luxury SUV, stepping onto my gravel driveway like she was inspecting a piece of real estate she already owned. She looked at the lake. Then she looked at me. "You know," she said, adjusting her sunglasses, "this area would look much better if it followed community standards." I remember smiling because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. Within months, Victoria started putting up signs around the shoreline. HOA members only. Fishing access restricted. Private community resource. The first time I saw that sign, I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was impossible. She wasn't just creating rules. She was rewriting reality. I walked into the HOA office with copies of my property documents and calmly explained that the shoreline behind my cabin was private land with protected access rights. Victoria didn't even look at the papers. She leaned back in her chair, folded her arms, and gave me the kind of smile people use when they think they're being generous. "Ethan, sometimes people don't understand how communities work." That sentence stayed with me, because she wasn't confused. She wasn't mistaken. She truly believed her position gave her power over everyone else. And that was when I realized something important. Victoria Harrington wasn't protecting a neighborhood. She was building a kingdom. She just didn't realize the man standing in her way had spent his entire life learning exactly how kingdoms fall. The first time Victoria Harrington crossed the line, I let it go. The second time, I documented it. By the third time, she had no idea she was building the evidence that would eventually destroy her own authority. Victoria had a talent for making unreasonable things sound official. She never walked into a room and said, "I want control." No, she used softer words. Community safety, property protection, maintaining standards. But behind every polished phrase was the same message. Do what Victoria says. When she became president of Silver Pines Lakeside Community, everything around the neighborhood started changing. The peaceful streets where people once waved at each other became places where residents looked over their shoulders before speaking. The monthly HOA meetings stopped feeling like discussions and started feeling like courtroom hearings where Victoria was always the judge. She sat at the front table with a thick binder, perfectly organized, every page marked with colored tabs. She loved paperwork, because paperwork made people afraid. The first letter I received from her was about my fishing dock. According to Victoria, my small wooden dock was visually inconsistent with the community's future development goals. I read that sentence 3 times. A dock my father built with his own hands was now considered a problem because it didn't match someone's idea of luxury. I looked out the window at the lake that evening. The sun was dropping behind the trees, turning the water orange. The same water my father and I had protected for decades suddenly felt like someone was trying to erase it. I replied politely. I included copies of my property records. I explained that the dock was on my land and had existed long before the HOA was created. I thought that would end it. I was wrong. 3 days later, Victoria sent another letter. This one came with a fine, $750. The reason? Unauthorized private use of a community shoreline. I actually laughed when I saw it. Not because it was funny, because it was impossible. The woman who had never stepped foot on my property before becoming HOA president was now claiming ownership over my family's shoreline. So I went to the HOA office again. Victoria was sitting behind her desk, sipping coffee while looking through reports. The smell of expensive perfume filled the room before she even looked up. "Ethan," she said, almost like she was disappointed I had returned. "I really hoped you would understand by now." "Understand what?" I asked. "That the lake belongs to the community." That sentence told me everything. She didn't believe the lake belonged to the community. She believed the lake belonged to her. I placed my documents on her desk. "Victoria, these records show my family owns this shoreline." She glanced down for barely 2 seconds before pushing them back toward me. "Old paperwork doesn't always matter." That was the moment I stopped trying to convince her. Because people like Victoria don't ignore facts because they don't understand them. They ignore facts because they believe they are powerful enough to replace them. Over the next few months, she continued escalating. New signs appeared near the water. Residents were warned not to fish near my shoreline. Neighbors who had known my family for years suddenly became afraid to speak. Some apologized quietly when they passed by. Others told me Victoria had threatened them with fines too. That was when I started paying closer attention. I stopped seeing her actions as random harassment. There was a pattern. Every threat, every notice, every false claim. She was leaving a trail. And Victoria Harrington had no idea that every piece of paper she created was bringing me closer to the moment when the truth would finally come out. The morning Victoria Harrington called the authorities, she was smiling like she had already won. She didn't realize that one phone call would become the biggest mistake she ever made. It started with a small piece of paper. That's usually how people like Victoria operate. Not with a bulldozer. Not with a dramatic confrontation. With paperwork. A violation notice appeared on my front door early one Monday morning. The paper was thick, expensive, and printed on official HOA letterhead. The kind of document designed to make ordinary people panic before they even read the first sentence. I stood there on my porch, holding my coffee, feeling the cold morning air against my face while I read it. Unauthorized fishing activity. I actually had to read it twice. Fishing. That was the crime Victoria had decided to punish me for. Not damaging property. Not breaking a law. Not harming wildlife. Fishing. On the shoreline my family owned. I looked down at the lake. The surface was completely still, except for the small ripples created by a bird landing near the reeds. The smell of wet wood and fresh water filled the air. It was peaceful, until Victoria decided peace needed permission. I went to the HOA office that afternoon. She was waiting for me. Not surprised. Not confused. Waiting. That was the part that bothered me. Victoria sat behind her desk with a confident expression, her fingers resting on the same binder filled with rules she had created and interpreted however she wanted. "Ethan," she said, "I was hoping you would come in so we could resolve this like adults." I placed the notice on her desk. "Resolve what?" "You're fining me for fishing on my own property." She smiled. "That shoreline is part of the community experience." There it was again. The language. Not ownership. Not legal rights. Just vague phrases designed to sound official. I leaned forward. "Victoria, you don't own that shoreline." Her smile disappeared for half a second. Just half. But I saw it. A crack. Then she recovered. "You seem to misunderstand how these things work." No, I understood perfectly. She wanted me to believe her authority was bigger than the law. Over the next few weeks, Victoria became more aggressive. She sent more notices. She placed additional signs near the water. She warned residents that anyone supporting my fishing access could face community consequences. Some neighbors stopped walking near the lake altogether. Others quietly apologized. One elderly couple who had known my father for years stopped by my cabin one evening. They stood near the dock, looking around before speaking. "She's scaring people," the husband whispered. I asked why nobody challenged her. He looked toward the neighborhood entrance. Then he said something I still remember. "Because nobody wants to become her next target." That was when I realized this wasn't just about fishing anymore. Victoria wasn't protecting the lake. She was controlling it. And people were afraid because she had convinced them that her position gave her unlimited power. But there was something she didn't understand. Real authority doesn't come from a title printed on a sign. It comes from facts. It comes from records. It comes from knowing exactly where the line is drawn. And Victoria was about to step so far across that line that even she wouldn't be able to walk back. The final mistake came 3 days later. I was sitting on the dock just before sunrise when I heard the sound of tires crushing gravel behind me. 2 official vehicles stopped near the shoreline. Victoria stepped out first. She looked directly at me. Then she pointed. That's him. The wildlife officers walked toward me, and Victoria smiled, because she thought she had finally found the weapon that would end this. She had no idea she had just called the one group of people who could expose everything she had been hiding. The moment Victoria Harrington saw the wildlife officers step onto my property, she looked like someone who had already collected her trophy. She didn't come for a conversation. She came for a victory. The gravel crunched beneath their boots as they walked toward the dock. The morning air was still cold, carrying the smell of wet earth, pine trees, and the lake water moving gently against the shore. Victoria stood behind them with her arms crossed. That smile was still there. The same smile she wore every time she handed someone a violation notice. The same smile she used when she thought a signature on a piece of paper made her untouchable. "Officer," she said, pointing toward me, "this man has been illegally fishing in a restricted HOA area." I looked at the officers. Then I looked at Victoria. I almost wanted to ask her if she had hurt herself, but I didn't, because something told me this was exactly what she wanted. She wanted me angry. She wanted me defensive. She wanted me to make a mistake. So I simply placed my fishing rod on the dock and waited. The older officer stepped forward first. "Sir, can we see some identification and any documents related to this property?" "Of course," I said. My voice was calm. That seemed to bother Victoria more than anything else. She expected panic. She expected an argument. Instead, I reached into my truck and pulled out my folder. The same folder I had carried for years. Inside were property records, maps, permits, and documents my father had carefully preserved long before Victoria Harrington ever knew this lake existed. Victoria laughed quietly. "Those papers don't change the fact that he's violating community rules." The younger officer glanced at her. "Ma'am, we still need to review the information." For the first time that morning, Victoria's confidence shifted. Just slightly. But I noticed. Because people like her depend on everyone believing they are already right. The officers opened the folder. The sound of paper moving in the quiet morning felt louder than it should have. Page after page. Map after map. Their expressions slowly changed. Victoria didn't notice at first. She was too busy explaining. "Our HOA has worked very hard to maintain this area. We have residents paying fees to preserve this lake." The older officer looked up. "Preserve it?" "Yes." He glanced back at the documents, then at the shoreline, then at Victoria. Something changed. Not dramatically, not like a movie scene, just a quiet shift. The kind that happens when someone realizes the story they were told isn't the truth. Victoria stepped closer. "Is there a problem?" The officer didn't answer immediately. He kept reading, and I remember watching Victoria's face during those few seconds. Because for the first time since I met her, she looked uncertain. Not angry, not arrogant. Uncertain. That was the moment I knew. She had made a mistake. A big one. She thought calling wildlife officers would prove I was trespassing. She thought they would walk onto my land and remove me. But she never considered one possibility. What if they discovered she was the one who didn't understand the law? The officer finally closed the folder. "Mr. Caldwell." He looked at me differently now. Not like a person being investigated. Like someone whose name carried history. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." He looked toward the lake, then back at me. "Are you the Ethan Caldwell who worked on the Silver Pines watershed restoration project?" Victoria's smile disappeared, because she didn't know that name meant something. She didn't know the man she was trying to remove wasn't just a fisherman standing by the water. She had no idea she had just called the person who helped protect it. The second the wildlife officer said my name, Victoria Harrington stopped smiling. And that was the moment she realized this was no longer about a fishing violation. It was about everything she had done to get there. The older officer looked at the documents again, carefully turning each page. "This property file, where did you get this?" I pointed toward the lake. "My father kept every record, every permit, every agreement. He believed if you respected the land, you protected it." The officer nodded slowly, because he knew exactly what he was looking at. The documents weren't just old papers sitting in a folder. They were the history of Silver Pines Lake. Years before Victoria created her HOA rules, before the neighborhood roads were paved, before anyone started talking about community access, my father worked with state conservation officials to protect the shoreline from erosion and illegal development. And years later, I continued that work. I spent over a decade studying water systems, wildlife habitats, and conservation laws. I wasn't just someone who owned a cabin near a lake. I was one of the people who helped make sure lakes like this survived. Victoria had spent months pretending she was protecting the water. She had no idea I had spent my life actually doing it. The younger officer looked at the signs Victoria had installed near the shoreline. "Ma'am, who authorized these restrictions?" Victoria immediately answered. "The HOA board." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Did the HOA receive approval from the state to restrict access to this area?" Her confidence faded, just for a second, but everyone saw it. "Well, the community owns the shoreline experience," she said. That phrase almost made me laugh. The shoreline experience. Not the shoreline. Not the property. Not the legal rights. Just another carefully chosen phrase designed to make something false sound official. The officer walked toward the sign. His boots pressed into the dirt as he read the words printed in bold letters. "Private HOA fishing area." Then he looked back at Victoria. "Ma'am, do you understand that posting a sign does not create ownership?" The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had heard that morning. Victoria opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time, she didn't have an answer ready. And that was when the entire situation changed. Because Victoria had built her power around one simple idea: that nobody would challenge her. That people would see the paperwork, hear the confident voice, and assume she must be right. But the law doesn't care who sounds the most confident. It cares about facts. And the facts were not on her side. The officer handed my documents back. "Mr. Caldwell, everything here appears to be in order." Then he did something Victoria never expected. He extended his hand. I shook it. A simple gesture. A few seconds. But for Victoria, it was devastating. Because she had called them expecting an arrest. Instead, they were showing respect. She stood there watching the entire plan collapse without a single dramatic argument. No shouting. No confrontation. Just the quiet sound of truth replacing a lie. But Victoria wasn't finished. People like her rarely walk away when they lose. She looked at me with a different expression now. Not confidence. Not superiority. Something much closer to fear. Because she finally understood something. The wildlife officers hadn't come to remove me from the lake. They had come to reveal who actually belonged there. And Victoria Harrington had just discovered that the person she tried to intimidate was the one person who could expose everything. The most dangerous moment for Victoria Harrington wasn't when the wildlife officers arrived. It wasn't when they questioned her signs or checked my documents. It was when she realized the entire neighborhood had been watching, and they were finally ready to speak. For months, Victoria had controlled Silver Pine's lakeside community with the same strategy. Fear. She never needed to yell. She never needed to threaten people directly. She simply sent letters. Official-looking notices. Warnings filled with legal words most residents didn't understand. And slowly, people stopped fighting back. But after the wildlife officers left my property that morning, something changed. The story was no longer just between Victoria and me. People started asking questions. Neighbors who had stayed silent began approaching me near the lake. One man named Harold from across the street stopped by my dock carrying a folder of his own. The same kind of folder I had carried when Victoria tried to have me removed. "She did this to you too?" he asked. I opened the folder. Inside were violation notices, fishing restrictions, warnings about unauthorized shoreline activity. But Harold wasn't a fisherman. He was a retired teacher who had lived there for 18 years. Victoria had sent him a fine because his grandchildren were sitting near the water during a family picnic. Another neighbor came forward. Then another. Each person had a different story, different dates, different excuses. But the pattern was exactly the same. Victoria had been using the HOA rules as a weapon. She wasn't maintaining the community. She was controlling it. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with every document spread out in front of me. The smell of old paper filled the room. My father's record sat beside Victoria's violation letters. Two completely different worlds. One represented responsibility. The other represented control. And when I placed them side by side, the truth became obvious. Victoria's power depended on one thing. Nobody checking. Nobody reading. Nobody challenging her. But now people were looking. And once people start looking, secrets don't stay buried for long. A week later, the HOA held an emergency meeting. Victoria walked in wearing the same confident expression she always had. Perfect hair, perfect outfit, perfect smile. She expected to walk into another room full of quiet residents. She was wrong. The atmosphere felt different. People weren't whispering anymore. They weren't avoiding eye contact. They were waiting. Victoria stood at the front of the room and started explaining how she was simply protecting property values, how she was defending community standards, how she was acting in everyone's best interest. Then Harold stood up. He placed his documents on the table. "You fined my family for sitting near a lake that isn't yours." The room went silent. Then another resident stood. Then another. One by one, people started sharing their experiences. Every complaint, every unfair fine, every moment they felt powerless. Victoria tried interrupting. She tried redirecting the conversation. She tried using the same confidence that worked before. But this time, nobody believed it. Because confidence can hide a mistake. It cannot erase evidence. By the end of the meeting, the HOA board requested a full review of her actions. Financial records, violation notices, property claims, everything. Victoria left the room without saying a word. For the first time since I met her, she didn't look like someone in control. She looked like someone who finally understood the truth. Power isn't about how many people you can intimidate. It's about what happens when those people stop being afraid. And Victoria Harrington had just lost the one thing she depended on most. Silence. The final mistake Victoria Harrington made wasn't calling the wildlife officers. It wasn't even trying to control my lake. It was believing that once the truth came out, she could simply explain it away. She couldn't, because by then, the evidence was everywhere. The HOA review started quietly. That was the part Victoria hated most. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting match, no angry crowd surrounding her. Just people sitting at tables, opening files, and reading the documents she thought nobody would ever question. And that silence was louder than any argument. The review committee began with the fishing restrictions, then the shoreline notices, then the fines. Every document had Victoria's signature attached. Every decision led back to the same person, her. I remember sitting in that meeting room watching pages move across the table. The smell of printer ink filled the air, mixed with the stale coffee sitting near the committee members. Victoria sat across from me. For once, she wasn't talking. She wasn't correcting anyone. She wasn't explaining why everyone else was wrong. She was listening, and I think that was the first time she truly understood what was happening. Her authority was disappearing one piece of paper at a time. The financial review came next. That was when things became much worse for her. The committee discovered that HOA resources had been used to install unauthorized signs around the lake. Money had been spent enforcing rules that didn't actually exist. Residents had been charged fees based on restrictions that had no legal foundation. The same system Victoria used to intimidate people was now the system exposing her. And that was the irony. She trusted paperwork more than people. So paperwork became her downfall. A few weeks later, the HOA held another meeting. This time, the room felt completely different. The same residents who once sat quietly with their heads down were now standing together. Victoria walked in slowly. She looked around. No one moved. No one avoided her eyes. The fear was gone. The board president opened the meeting by announcing the findings. Multiple unauthorized restrictions, improper enforcement actions, abuse of HOA authority. The words echoed through the room. Victoria tried to defend herself. She said she was protecting property values. She said she was misunderstood. She said she was only trying to help. But those excuses sounded different now, because everyone had seen what happened when she was challenged. The wildlife officers had not arrested me. They had not removed me from the shoreline. They had shaken my hand. And that simple moment had destroyed the image Victoria spent years building. The woman who claimed to protect the lake had never truly understood it. The lake was never about control. It was about respect. After the vote was completed, Victoria Harrington was removed from her position as HOA president. The room stayed quiet. Nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated. Because real justice doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it arrives with a signature. Sometimes it arrives with a vote. Sometimes it arrives when someone who spent years making others feel powerless finally loses the power they abused. A few days later, I walked back down to my dock. The morning air smelled exactly like it always had. Fresh water, pine trees, wet wood, the same sounds, the same lake. But everything felt different. Not because Victoria was gone, because the people around it finally understood something important. The lake never belonged to the loudest person in the room. It belonged to the people who respected it. And Victoria Harrington had spent so long trying to own everything that she forgot one simple truth. You can pretend to have authority. You can demand obedience. You can scare people into silence. But eventually, the truth finds a way to speak. The last time I saw Victoria Harrington standing near Silver Pines Lake, she wasn't holding a clipboard. She wasn't handing out violation notices. She wasn't telling people what they could and couldn't do. She was standing quietly, watching the water. And for the first time, she looked like someone who finally understood that she never owned it. The lake looked exactly the same. The morning mist still floated above the surface. The old wooden dock still creaked beneath my boots. The same birds still moved through the trees, and the same breeze carried the smell of pine and fresh water across the shoreline. But something had changed. For years, Victoria had convinced herself that power came from controlling people. She believed a title could make her important. She believed a stack of rules could replace the truth. She believed that if she spoke confidently enough, nobody would question her. But she learned something that day. Authority isn't created by fear. It is earned through responsibility. I thought about my father as I stood there holding the fishing rod he gave me years ago. I remembered his hands repairing that old dock. I remembered his voice telling me that the land doesn't belong to the person who claims it the loudest. It belongs to the person willing to protect it. That lesson stayed with me long after Victoria was gone. Because this story was never really about fishing. It was never just about a dock. It was never just about an HOA president who wanted control. It was about what happens when someone mistakes kindness for weakness. For months, I could have fought Victoria the way she fought everyone else. I could have yelled. I could have embarrassed her. I could have tried to destroy her reputation. But that wouldn't have changed anything. The truth didn't need anger. It needed patience. It needed evidence. It needed time. And eventually, the truth stood on its own. The most satisfying part wasn't watching Victoria lose her position. It wasn't seeing the signs removed from the shoreline. It wasn't hearing the vote that ended her control. The most satisfying part was watching the neighbors who once felt powerless realize they had a voice. People who had spent years staying quiet finally started speaking. They stopped accepting every letter. They started reading every document. They started asking questions. And that was the real victory. Because people like Victoria depend on one thing more than anything else. Silence. The moment people stop being silent, their power begins to disappear. Today, I still fish at Silver Pines Lake. Sometimes early in the morning. Sometimes right before sunset. I still use my father's old rod. I still sit on that same dock. And every time the line touches the water, I remember that morning when 2 wildlife officers arrived expecting to investigate a problem. Instead, they uncovered the truth. They didn't put handcuffs on me. They didn't remove me from my own shoreline. They shook my hand. And that small gesture proved something Victoria never understood. The law doesn't care who has the loudest voice. It doesn't care who has the biggest house, the nicest car, or the most impressive title. It only cares about what is true. So if there's one thing I learned from everything that happened, it's this. Never underestimate someone who stays calm while everyone else is trying to create chaos. Because justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it arrives quietly. Sometimes it comes with a folder of documents. Sometimes it comes with a handshake. And sometimes, the person who calls the authorities is the one who should have been worried all along.